All right, let's get started. Welcome and thank you for joining today's webinar, How to Use a Least Privileged User Account Strategy to Balance User Empowerment and Security in a Windows Environment, with Derek A. Smith. You're also joined by Jason Silva from Beyond Trust, who will run through a brief overview of PowerBroker for Windows towards the end of the webinar, so please stick around for that. My name is Sarah, and I am your host today. A kind reminder to please submit your questions via the chat box in the GoToMeeting console anytime throughout the webinar, and we will cover your questions at the end during our Q&A time. Also, today's session is being recorded, and you'll receive a follow-up email with the recording and presentation next week. Okay, so now that that's all out of the way, let's jump right in with Derek. Hey there, Derek. Welcome. How you doing? Thanks for being with us today.
Great. Thanks. Good to be back once again, everyone. Welcome, everybody. Hello. And happy holidays. Holidays are coming up soon. Just a real quick intro. Again, my name is Derek Smith. I am the former director of the National Cybersecurity Institute at Excelsior College, and now I'm a fellow there. I'm also a government IT program manager. I've written a book on cybersecurity and part of another book. As you can see from the picture there, I go on local and national television as a cybersecurity expert, and I teach at several universities like the University of Maryland, Baltimore College, University of Maryland University College, Excelsior, and a few others. I'm a former federal agent for 18 years, a special agent with the federal government, and I served in the Air Force, the Navy, and the Army. I have 9 college degrees, so I have quite a few degrees in this stuff. So I speak from an educational background as well as practical knowledge around IT security. That is my main specialty. So with that being said, I want to dive right into the material, how to use a least privileged user account strategy to balance user empowerment and security in a Windows environment. That kind of gives you an idea of what we're going to talk about today. So basically, what I'm going to discuss are issues and concerns that organizations like ours have or might face when they apply what's called a least privileged user account approach to their computers that run Microsoft Windows type products. Okay, I'm going to cover things like what the least privileged user account approach is, risks associated with administrative privileges. I'm going to give you a definition of principles of the principle of least privilege, definition of this approach. I'm going to call it LUA from now on because we're going to say it quite a bit. Benefits of this LUA approach, how to implement it, and then we're going to talk about, again, a product that we have that we think will be very, very useful for you if you have a Windows environment. So let's get started. First of all, we know that recent advances that we have in our devices and our networking technology and all those type of things have brought great or enormous opportunities to the various organizations out here of all different types of sizes. But unfortunately, as we all know, because we're all professionals here, is that when there's a connection between a computer and any network, especially the internet, it's going to give us an increased level of risk from things like malicious software, external hackers, all those type of things that's going to be able to target our systems, old and new. There's going to be new things that we don't even know about. So a significant factor that we have that increases the risk from these type of malicious activities that I described is a tendency for organizations like ours to give users administrative rights to their client computers. And I'm going to talk about some of the reasons we do that, but it opens up a whole nother can of worms for us. So when a user or an administrator logs on with these administrative rights, any programs that they run, like their browsers, their applications that they're using, email clients, instant messaging, you name it, those things too are going to have administrative rights. And if those programs actually activate some of that malicious software that gets on there, that malicious software can in turn install itself on our system or our network. It can manipulate the services that we have, like our antivirus programs, and it can even hide itself from our operating system through rootkits and things like that. So the users end up running this malicious software unintentionally and unknowingly, and then they've compromised our system, right? So this is one of the reasons why we want to have more control over that Windows environment in the number of ways that I'm going to recommend and talk about today. So first of all, let's take a look at what administrative rights actually mean on your computer in the first place. You know, and what is it? Well, mainly in this Windows environment. Okay, so first let me begin by saying this. When we're using our standard user accounts to perform those day-to-day activities that we do at work, like managing our email, using that web browser I talked about, you know, when we communicate using instant messaging and things like that, we know that when we do it from using a standard user's account, it's a lot more secure practice than using an account with administrative privileges, of course, to do these same tasks. It's also less expensive for us to do that. And why is that? Because isn't this approach going to be less convenient, more, well, we would think it would be less convenient and more time consuming, but it's not, because if that computer that you're using is never exposed to the malware in the first place, or malicious users or external attackers in the first place, then maybe it wouldn't drive costs up for us having to mitigate the problems that we have. Okay? So going to this slide that I have in front of you, what does administrative rights mean to us in the first place? We have a couple of things here that I want to discuss. First of all, when I talk about the term administrator account and I talk about administrative rights, they're going to have similar meanings when we talk about a Windows environment, but they're not actually identical. They're not absolutely the same type of account. Now, it's going to be possible that when we have a user who don't belong to the built-in administrator group that's within Windows, they can be assigned user rights that's going to enable them to perform some advanced administrative tasks. Okay, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit as we go on. So those people are going to have these somewhat, or I'll call them effective administrative rights, because I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in just a second. That's going to enable that user to perform various administrative activities, right? So what are some of those administrative rights that I'm speaking of? So when I talk about built-in administrator rights or a built-in administrator account and an administrator group, it's kind of self-evident what they are, but I'm going to get a little bit more deeper into it. So when I say effective administrative rights, as I just mentioned before, in Windows, they're going to be permissions that can be configured on the different objects that you have, including your files, your folders, your printers, your registry keys, and things like that. And the default permissions on most of the system's objects that we have are going to grant full control to people who are assigned to administrator group. So Windows is going to utilize, or also utilizes user rights in order to try to determine what system operations a specific user group, well, not a specific user or a specific group should be allowed to perform, or allowed to use on your network. So some of the system operation settings that we're going to have, or that we can put out there, are going to be moderately risky to our organization, right? And those are going to be granted to all the accounts that belong in that user's group. But luckily they're in the user group, correct? Because they're in a user group, they're not going to affect too many different things. But I'll talk about that in a second. So we have things like recover a computer from the docking station, or allow log on locally, those type of settings that are going to be assigned to that user group. So access to those more risky settings that we have are going to be limited to groups and accounts in which the standard users are not going to be assigned. At least they should not be assigned. I hope you haven't assigned them in your organization. However, those settings that we have are still not going to be equivalent to those with administrator rights. Some examples of those kind of things include things like your backup files and your directories, your log on as batch job, all those type of user rights settings. Now, when we look at it from a different point of view, on the other hand, we're going to have a list of things that some user rights, when granted some type of administrative uses, they're going to have permission to do, or things that they can do. And I have some of them up on the slide here. First, they can act as part of an operating system. So anybody that we give this user right, this effective administrative right or administrator right, they can take control of the computer and they can raise evidence of their activities, of things they're doing. So they can act as part of that operating system. Those folks with those rights can also debug programs. So this user right, if we give it to them, they can exploit it to capture some of the sensitive computer information that we have on our system memory. They can access and modify kernel activity or the data that's on the kernel. They can use some types of attack tools in order to exploit our system and things like that I talked about in those rootkits that I mentioned earlier. Number 3, they can load and unload device drivers. So device drivers run as highly privileged code on our network, right? So a user who has this user right could unintentionally or intentionally, but unintentionally install malicious code that masquerades as device driver and then give them some control of our device. They can restore files and directories. So anybody with this user right can restore sensitive data to a computer and overwrite data that's more recent. Okay, and what does this do? If you're in the IT security, this can lead to loss of some of the important data that we have. It can lead to data corruption. It can even lead to some denial of service type of things. So we have a malicious attacker come into our network. They can overwrite our executable files that's used by our legitimate administrators, and then that can include granting themselves elevated privileges. And this is what this thing is all about, making sure that folks have least privilege and least access to the information. But now through this, they have elevated privileges. So they can also compromise data. They can go and install backdoors, and on and on. And the last thing is they can take ownership of our files and our other objects. So if they have this right, they can control any of the objects that we have on our system. Okay, regardless of the permissions that we put on that object, and then they can make changes, any changes that they want to that object. Okay, and then this can result in exposure of our data, corruption of our data, or even complete compromise of our entire network or our entire computer. So these are the type of things that by us giving a user effective administrative rights could occur. So this is one of the reasons why we want to make sure that we don't do these type of things. So here's the balance that I talked about. Now we have to have a balance between the ease of use for those different users and then our security continuum. How much security do we want inside our organization? All right. So in general, as I have on the slide, we know that there's a clear trade-off between increasing the security that we have and then making our system easier to use. Okay. And I have an example I like to give, and I'll talk about the example of when you have the door to your house. And if you go out and you install a deadbolt lock on your door, you know that you're going to have to issue keys to everybody that needs to enter and leave that door, right? Leave your house. They're going to have a special key for that, all right? But what does that do on the flip side? That makes it easier for any uninvited guests or hackers, any uninvited guests to enter our house. But what happens next? A skilled hacker or a skilled thief can go back and they can pick that lock, they can just go in and basically kick the door in or break it down with a ram. So what we do is we can go in and install a security bar or some type of door brace on that door, and then we're going to have some even extra provided security there. But a lot of the designs for this can only be put in place or removed by somebody that's inside that house. And who's that person inside that house? That's our administrator, right? So again, there's going to be a trade-off here between that ease of use of security. As you see, I gave you that example. It becomes harder and harder to use that door because we have the door bar there, we have a brace, we have keys that have to be issued. Now we have a deadbolt lock. We have all these things in place, kind of our defense in depth strategy, and I'll talk more about that in just a little while. Okay? Now, there's also going to be a similar trade-off decision that we have to make when we decide whether we're going to require all users in our organization to perform the majority of their work with standard user accounts and then restrict that administrative access to only our administrators or some subgroup of our IT personnel who actually need it to perform some type of specific task that we have in our organization. So that's the trade-off. So if we or our organization currently allows a lot of our staff members to use account with administrative rights, when we make the transition after you listen to what I tell you today and you go back and make that transition to accounts with limited rights, it's going to be kind of challenging, right? Because they already have been used to having the keys to the kingdom, so to speak. Now, on the other hand, if your organization already restricts the administrative rights to a subset of personnel like the executives or the IT staff, then the transition is going to be easier. Okay? You're still going to have a few difficulties, but it's going to be easier. Just as a quick example, when I worked at TSA, the lead of TSA where I worked, he had administrative rights to the entire system. Now, this guy wasn't even an IT guy. He was a business guy. He ran the TSA organization where we were. It's called Secure Flight, the Secure Flight Program, which secured the entire flight list, no-fly list. So I told him, I went and said, well, I was the ISSO, Information System Security Officer, and I said, why does this guy have administrative rights to our entire system? If anybody compromises him, the system's going to be compromised, and he's not an IT person. And you know what the reaction was to me? They asked me, well, Derek, are you going to tell him? Are you going to tell him he doesn't have it? And I said, yes, I'm going to tell him because that's my job. I need to tell him. You know, nobody wanted to go to him and take his administrative rights away, even though they knew that this was a bad thing. So of course I went to him, and once I explained to him why it was bad, he had no problem with it. You know, he's like, I didn't ask him to give me administrative rights in the first place, and he understood the risk that came along with that, and he'd rather give that up than to take that risk. Besides, he never went into it anyway. He had no reason to go into it. Okay? So again, we have to make that decision. Where do we want to be as far as ease of use, and then where do we want to be as far as our security is concerned? Now, let's talk about this least privilege account theory in the first place, and what it is that we're trying to accomplish and what it is we want to do. Now, I'm going to get deeper into it in just a second, but as I said just a slide or so ago, is that we're looking at a defense in depth strategy. And what does that mean? That means we want to have overlapping layers of security, and that's going to be one of the best ways that we use to counter the different threats that I talked about a little bit earlier when I gave my example. Now, we're going to have what we call this least privileged user account approach, where it's going to ensure, well, it's going to be an important part first of that defense in depth strategy, and that's why I mentioned in the first place. But what it's going to do is it's going to ensure that the users that we have and that we assign to our Windows environment follow the principle of least privilege. And that's mainly what it's all about, the principle of least privilege. And I'll talk about that in a second as well. And that they're always going to log in with a limited user account, not the super user, not the administrative account, none of that. And what this strategy is going to aim to do is going to try to limit the use of those administrative credentials to just the administrators, the people that should have them, and then only when they're doing the administrative tasks. Because you know we have problem with administrators using their administrative account to go out and search the internet or whatever it may be. But no, we don't want that. We want them to use it the way it's supposed to be used. And if we do that, what's going to happen? Basically, if we use this LUA approach that we have, it's going to significantly mitigate the risk that we have from malicious software and accidental incorrect configurations of our systems in the first place. Okay? So because, well, let me say a however here. Because that LUA approach is going to require organizations to plan, to test, and support limited access configurations, this approach oftentimes can be can end up generating significant costs for us and significant challenges for us, because of course it needs a little bit more administration. It's easy to go and assign a bunch of folks to a bunch of groups and not have to worry about it. So we have to be a little bit more conscientious, right? And we have to make sure that we're using these things the way that we're supposed to be using. So that's going to be the challenge. It's not a big challenge. It's something we need to do anyway, but of course, just like anything else, it is somewhat of a challenge. So let's start with a definition of least privilege. Okay? And basically, as you see here, I'm going to give you a couple of different things, but the principle of least privilege is the practice of limiting access to the minimal level that will allow normal functioning. So that's not that difficult. We know exactly what that's all about. Give people only the rights that they need to get their job done. Okay? So what this does, if you look at DOD has a guideline 5200-28, and what they say is that you give them the amount of rights that requires that each subject in a system be granted the most restrictive set of privileges or the lowest clearance, because it's DOD, needed for them to perform their authorized tasks. Okay? So that's what least privilege is all about as far as the definition is concerned. Okay? What does this do for us, though? What it does is a couple of things. If they don't have access to a lot of the material that we have, a lot of data on our network, it's going to limit the amount of damage that can result from someone going out and doing something accidentally or error or some type of unauthorized use, and people get higher privileges than they were supposed to because we've limited that in the first place, and they can't even get to the stuff that they're not supposed to get to. All right? So now I'm going to go a little bit deeper into the LUA approach, the principle of least privilege, least user approach that we have a little bit further. So I gave you a definition, but the definition looks at this as a practical implementation that we're going to do of that principle of least privilege that I just talked about, and especially in the Windows environment, because this is about a Windows environment. It says here specifically users, programs, and services on Windows. And it says it should have only the minimum rights and permissions that are required to carry out their assigned tasks. So we're taking that least privilege definition that I gave you before, and now we're putting this approach into fruition or into play. So this LUA approach is going to be a combination of things. And what it's going to be is a combination of recommendations, tools, best practices that we have, even software, that we, third-party software or whatever we're going to use, that's going to allow us to be able to use non-administrative accounts to operate computers that run Windows. That's our goal. So this approach is going to require our organizations, if we're the security people, it might require us to go back and reevaluate the role of computers and the level of access that the users should have to those computers in our environment or in our enterprise. What it's also going to do for us is also going to address both our strategic goals and our day-to-day considerations that we have for from operating under limited user accounts. It's going to address issues that come when we do operate with these limited user accounts. Okay? And this is going to include areas like when we have remote users that need to make configuration changes to our computers and things like that, and they have this limited access. What do we do now? All right? This approach is also going to apply to applications, application development and testing. What applications are we going to allow to run in our Windows environment? So when we have developers, and even when we have our testers, because they have access as well, they're going to typically log on to our computers, or I'll say their computers, with accounts that have administrative rights, right? Their testers, their developers, they have accounts with administrative rights. And what's going to happen is that and let me take a step back. I hope I don't want to offend any developers that might be on the call, but oftentimes developers are thinking about usability and functionality of a program and making sure that it's working. They don't so much think about the security aspect the way we do as security professionals. So therefore, that configuration can result in developers releasing compiled programs that require elevated privileges to run. And then we could easily have a compromise from a mistake out there. Okay, so rather than redesign the application to work correctly, the developer is often going to have some type of security workaround in order to do his job, like placing user accounts in the local administrative groups, or granting full user control to Windows system folders, or whatever it is they may be. So what happens is that when we put this LUA approach in place, it's going to go back and counteract the tendency for us to simply go out and grant administrative rights and permissions to every user or every program that requires access to a resource. Okay? So when we have programs, applications, and people that go out and follow the principle of least privilege, it's going to make our entire network, our entire system more secure. It's a good security practice. So first, before I do this, look at LUA, you need to generally kind of understand the principles behind, understand Windows accounts and how they work, and I'll go over this rather quickly. So to understand the principles behind this LUA approach I'm talking about, you need to be aware of the differences between administrative and non-administrative accounts in Windows, and you need to know how Windows starts and run programs and things like that. So I'm just going to take a brief look at the different type of accounts that we have. Now, computers that run Windows maintain an autonomous security database in their security accounts manager in some forms of Windows, some types of Windows. I hate to say I'm not up on Windows 10 that much yet. So this SAM, we call it, a security account manager, is going to be responsible for storing local user and group information, and it's going to include numerous default groups. So we're going to have our administrators, and they're going to have complete and unrestricted access to our computers, as you see here. We're going to have our power users, and they're going to have more limited administrative rights, such as sharing files and installing local printers, changing the system time, whatever it may be. But these power users also have extensive permissions to access files that's in the Windows system folders. We have our users, and they're going to have limited user rights, and they're going to be prevented from making accidental or intentional system-wide account changes because they have a limited account. Limited access because they're users. And then we have a guest, and those guests have even fewer rights than those limited users. Okay? So our user accounts are going to be granted their rights to membership in some type of group, the administrators, the power user, all through the administrative rights we give them in various groups. Now, when we log on, folks go on, they log on, they have a log-on process, okay? And they log into these different types of administrative groups that we have, or different groups that we spoke about just a few minutes ago. So this kind of process, they authenticate as either an administrator or they're going to authenticate as a user. And as you all know, when they do that, it's going to give them certain type of privileges that they have or certain types of access that they have. Okay, I won't break it all down and talk about how it happens technically. So we have this LUA approach that I spoke to you briefly about, and there are some benefits that we have that I want to talk about when we use these type of accounts. Let me just I want to make sure I did cover. Yes, okay, I did cover it. All right. So I want to go back just for 1 second and look at this process again, this logon process, because it's important for you to understand is this authentication process for Windows again. So when a user go in and they log onto their computer, that operating system again is going to authenticate that user credential, and they're going to start an instance of a Windows desktop, right? Because we're using Windows. So this desktop is going to run with the user security context with the logon user rights that they have and the permissions that they have. So when that user goes out and he starts that program, like Microsoft Explorer or whatever it may be, the program is also going to run in that user security context. What I mean is as an administrator or as a user. So I have here they're going to authenticate as an administrator again or as a user. So I just want to look at that just a little bit further. So if they authenticate as a member of the local administrator group, that desktop that they have and any programs that user starts is going to run with full access rights and permissions of the administrator. And I talked about that. So those people are going to have things like to install, start, stop services. They're going to be able to create, modify registries. They can replace operating systems files if they want to, terminate process. They can even control our firewall settings and other types of security mechanisms that we have in place. So that's going to be very important to note that if we end up giving somebody those rights, those are the type of things they'll be able to do. Now, if they authenticate as a user again, they're not going to be members of that administrator group, and they can only access a significantly reduced number of resources that we have out there. So they can view the status of services and device drivers. They can create, modify some registry settings. They can run programs, of course, view running processes. They can view the firewall settings, maybe, but they won't be able to change them. So this is very important to make note of that. So limited users, now I talked a little while ago about limited users and having a little bit more rights. Those limited users can still carry out tasks that are required to do their jobs, and so these people that don't have administrator rights, like such as attaching to the wireless network and installing plug and play and things like that, maybe even change a few desktop settings, but they're not going to be able to get the full keys to the kingdom. And so this LUA approach don't seek to limit their abilities. As I said in the title, they want to balance those out. They want to reduce those risks by limiting the accounts that have administrative rights, but still allow you to do some of the things that you need to do in order to do your job. Okay. Now let's get to those benefits I was talking about using this approach. So this LUA approach that I have is going to provide a number of benefits to your organization, no matter what type of organization you have. And it's also, in addition to reducing the risk that we have from attacks by that malicious code or those hackers that I talked about earlier, it's also going to be able to do these things: increase your security, increase manageability, increase productivity, reduce costs, reduce piracy and legal liability. So I want to just cover those just briefly so we can make sure we're clear on what I mean by that. So when we look at increased security, using this LUA approach is going to be one of a number of different types of security measures that we can put in place. Remember I talked about defense in depth? So we can put these different security measures in place that's going to be able to help us protect our organization, protect the different assets, protect our network from exploitation by attackers. Okay? They're going to look to try to compromise our network and escalate their privileges, and we want to make sure they're not able to do that. Now it's going to increase manageability. So by us having standardization in our organization, we'll be able to standardization in the organization. Okay, Windows is going to provide us the potential for us to customize our operating system configuration. So if our user can log on with administrative rights, they can often succumb to the temptation of changing some settings. Like I'm having a problem with my computer. I don't want to call the help desk. I'm just going to go ahead and change this on my own because I can. So we want to be careful about that because that action alone could lead to quick compromise of our computer. They don't know what they're doing. They can do something unintentionally, and folks are always on the lookout for how they can get into our systems and escalate their privileges all again. So quickly we could be compromised because all the network connections that we have, even the trusted networks, should have the protection of some type of host-based firewall, but now they have access to these type of things. Okay? So we don't want these user-initiated changes out there. They can end up for more calls at our help desk and, of course, compromise of our system. I say it increases productivity. So as we know that when we have computers, we have enormous when we came up with computers, let's say, we had an enormous increase in our productivity for organizations. However, those computers require some type of proactive management to maintain this productivity advantage that we have. You know, it's funny how the more that we brought security in place and the more the internet came on, it enabled us to do many things, but it also became detrimental in many ways that could harm productivity, like denial of service or a system being shut down. Okay, so if we have our organization and users depend on our computers to do their job, us as IT people, we as IT people need to minimize the likelihood of one of those disruptions I talked about coming. So by doing that, that's how we end up increasing the activity. Productivity. We maintain productivity through the maintenance of our clients' computer configurations that we have, security configurations, all those type of things. Okay. Now we know that lost productivity can occur when that malicious software takes over our computer. All right, and by not allowing it in the first place, now we've increased that productivity. Of course, I talk about reduced costs. So although we have the maintenance I just spoke of the different types of multiple client computers we have, we know it's not cost-free. And we have to look at the factors that's going to increase our costs, like, you know, having unique or untested combinations of hardware and software on our computers, or unknown changes in our operating system. Hopefully you're not doing that. You have a change process in place, but that can make things hard for us. You know, licenses not installed and all that kind of stuff. And then it reduces piracy and legal liability issues. We can do this. Well, first of all, let me start with this. You all know we have a lot of regulatory type compliance obligations for most of the organizations out there. And one of those is to prevent illegal use of our company equipment by our employees. So these obligations require us to take action when employees knowingly or unknowingly do something wrong. So we have to. So if we implement this LUA approach, it's going to significantly decrease that because they don't have the rights and the access to do certain things that's going to get us in trouble. Right? Good. So risk, security, usability, and cost trade-offs. So with all this that we're speaking of, like a lot of different approaches that we can take to network management, things like that, when we adopt this LUA method, it involves us making a business decision. We have to weigh the trade-off between our risks, our security, the usability for our employees and our other users, and the cost that's going to be involved. So when we properly implement this LUA approach, we can do several things. We can reduce risks, we can increase security, we can impact usability, and we can reduce administrative costs. Okay? Any connection that we have to our computer is going to have some type of element of risk, especially when we connect it to the internet, right? So the only way to remove that risk is either to completely, disconnect our computer from the network, or put some type of security things in place, okay? Security measures in place. Most of us are going to agree that the business benefits are going to outweigh us coming off the grid, so to speak. So we pretty much can't do that. But what we're going to do is we're going to go out and we're going to use this LUA approach to try to significantly reduce the current and the future risks that we have that results from programs running with administrative rights. So that's one of the things. Of course, it's going to increase security, as I spoke of, because the LUA approach is going to provide, least privilege. It's going to increase our security. Okay, so the trade-off that I spoke about is going to reduce the freedom for users to make configurations to their computers, configuration changes, but it's not going to necessarily reduce usability. Okay, it's going to be actually a good thing that we have. So it's important for us to understand that this LUA approach I'm talking about is not going to provide a complete security strategy. Again, this is part of that defense and depth strategy that I talk about. Okay, and then it impact usability. So again, this approach is going to prevent users from administering their own computers. I talked about that a lot, but it's not going to keep them from using them. Okay, some restrictions there, but you can still do your job. All we're doing is removing administrative rights. And removing those administrative rights is only going to make sure that those, well, I'll say this, only going to make those folks more productive because they're going to have fewer distractions from their work and they're going to have reduced opportunities to configure their computers incorrectly. So actually we're increasing usability. We're making a good impact on usability. And then it's going to reduce those administrative costs because again, when we use this approach, it's going to closely it's going to tie in closely with our systems management strategy that we should have in place because limited users can't change any of the enforced management settings that we put in place by our policies. Right? All right, moving right along. And we have our user account. So in Windows, we have our user account, okay? And this user account, as it says here, give me 1 second here to move something off my screen. Okay, so user account is a feature introduced in Windows Vista, I don't know why I have Vista there, but Windows that can help you stay in control of your computer by informing you when the program makes a change that requires administrative level permissions. So it's going to, if you see down below, it's going to pop up. You can turn it on and off. It's going to pop up and it's going to tell you that somebody is trying to make a change. Forgive the old slip up there. But it's going to tell you that someone is making a change. So it's going to give you a little bit of control over some of the things that you can do and hopefully try to prevent users from making mistakes that we don't want them to make. All right? So how do we take advantage of using least privilege in our organization in the first place? Okay? And there are going to be three basic approaches that we can use to do this. So depending on the version of Windows that you're running, there are going to be options that you can use to take advantage of the different concepts that I've been talking about so far, and I'm going to continue to talk about. So here's one of them. Number one, the least secure approach is going to be to log on to your computer using an account with administrative privileges, as it says here, and then rely on that UAC that I just spoke about to drop those privileges except when needed. So you'll log on, you might have this elevated privilege, but once it's not needed anymore, it goes away. This is called admin approval mode. And while this option might be suitable for us managing our servers and things like that, though, it's going to be a poor choice for us managing regular user computers because those, when hackers go out and they develop malware and things like that, they might be able to trick that user into approving their UAC prompts that they send them. They're gonna social engineer them, or those users might become tired of using those UAC prompts and they simply accept them all. They don't pay any attention. They accept everything that comes through. So it's not an effective way to manage this. Okay. Number two, a more secure approach is going to be to log onto your computer with a standard user account and elevate to administrative privileges only when you need to do so. Okay, and this is referred to as over-the-shoulder elevation, as it says. Well, it's over-the-shoulder elevation. What it does is it requires the entry of some type of credentials for an account that is a member of a certain administrator group. So in order to get those administrative rights, they're going to have to log in with those credentials. Okay. Now this action, action is going to happen. It's going to be completed by some other user typing over the shoulder of the standard user. Basically, is what it sounds like. Okay. Now it's still going to be somewhat risky to do this because the malware again can mimic those UAC prompts, and then it's going to collect passwords for administrator accounts. It's going to allow a bad guy to get in. So dropping down to number three. The most secure approach for us is to log on to our computer with a standard user account, but bypass the UAC. So instead of elevating applications on the current desktop section, you use some type of feature. I got the fast user switching feature in Windows, but some type of feature that's going to open a new desktop section with a dedicated administrator account to perform the administrative operations. Right? So these are our three ways that we can take advantage of putting some type of least privilege strategy in place that's going to kind of limit what it is that users can do on their own so they can't go in and mess things up. All right. When we're going to do this, we have to have some implementation considerations that we I guess have in mind, or things that we want to do to make sure that we're doing this correctly. And I have some of them right here on the screen here. So we're going to implement the LUA approach. Implementing is going to create technical, administrative, and political issues within an organization. I already talked about that. So we have to keep that in mind, that when we try to make that change that I spoke about a little earlier, and we want to go in and we want to do something different, there are going to be people that's going to balk at that, because they've been used to doing things a certain way. So we got to make sure that we address those concerns. Okay. we got to look at things like, again, who's going to have control of the computer I have here? Who's going to be able to install hardware? Who's going to install programs? Who's going to run programs? On and on. Who's going to do updates? Who's going to configure the cost and all those? And I won't go into each one of those individually. I plan to, but I'm going to not do that for time's sake. I'm going to keep us moving. Another thing, I'm going to continue with the implementation process here. Main thing about the implementation that I want to make sure that I do get to you, though, is that some type of decision is going to have to be made. Some type of business decision is going to have to be made on how do we do this and how do we make this conducive to what people need to actually accomplish on the computer. You know, that's also going to be safe for our business. Okay. Now, how do we do this? It's going to be essential for us, not just us security folks, but us as an organization, we to go out and then make sure that we get somebody that's high ranking, not just high ranking, but also technically educated to sponsor our project. So we're going to make this LUA change to follow this approach. We need a sponsor, okay? And that sponsor needs to go out and he needs to be able to educate his fellow management about the growing threat that we have from all the different things that can happen should we not do this type of strategy, you know, and of course they're all about cost and how it can save them costs, okay? And then if that education don't provide a forceful enough argument, we need to highlight the issues of the legal liability that can result from unintentional installation. That always helps. There's a lot of stuff in the news right now, and explain how the tools that we can put in place, we're going to talk about the tools in a minute, can actually address any type of concerns that they have. Okay, so user education is going to be very important. Well, management education, but also user education is going to be very important because the users are also going to feel threatened. They're going to feel threatened by any attempt that we make to remove control over what they see as their computer. You know, even though we say the company owns the computer, this is my computer, and they might take steps to try to disrupt implementation of our LUA approach. Right, so we have to make sure that we message it correctly for them as well, in order for them to in order for us to actually take advantage of this and put it in place. Okay. As I said, we want to limit those administrative credentials. We want to provide effective security when the users log on with administrative rights. I need to deploy tools that's going to minimize the risk of running programs as an administrator. I want to ensure that anything that's internet facing, like our email browsers, applications, instant messaging, all those align. Align with our policy by having limited user rights. And I want to monitor computers for unapproved administrator usage. And if I see that, of course, I want to correct that problem, and I want to make sure that we take that away from them. Okay. So and the main thing is if I'm an organization and I'm not able to implement this LUA approach in full, it's going to be possible for you to mitigate the risk for running programs or applications with administrative rights by ensuring that any programs that access network resources always run with limited user rights. And that's what I'm doing here on this slide when I explained that to you. Okay. Now, this approach does not comply with the principles of least privilege per se, but it is going to offer us some benefits, some type of benefits, and it's going to be better than simply allowing everybody to run all the programs with administrative rights that they want to. Okay, so we want to make sure that we look at these things I have here, these different types of effective security measures, and possibly put those in place. Okay, now I guess I want to, in my section here, we're looking at what I have here on the slide here. Basically, what I did is I want to introduce you just briefly to the principle of least privilege, and especially down to the user level. And I want to explain to you how implementing, this LUA approach that I have is going to be able to go out and improve your security on your Windows network or your Windows environment. And it's going to do it right away, okay? And it's also going to lower costs for you, and it's going to reduce the risk of you getting type of malware infections or hacks based on what your users are doing. And even if you are hacked, it's going to limit your impact of those hacks because, again, they won't be able to get any higher than that user have. So only a small group of users should have those administrative rights. And if they do have those administrative rights, they need to have a compelling reason or argument as to why they should have them. Okay? So with that being said, I want to bring my partner on, and he wants to tell you a little bit more about how you can deploy this least privilege methodology and some things he can use to help control that.
Thank you very much, Derek. Okay, guys, my name is Jason Silver. I'm a product manager here with Beyond Trust, and I focus on our endpoint solutions, right? So this thing called PowerBroker for Windows, which let me go ahead and share out real quick so you can actually see what I'm talking about. I don't have a lot of slides to show. My part here will be quick. We have PowerBroker for Mac, and then, of course, we have Endpoint Protection Platform, which is our AV. But today we're going to focus in on this PowerBroker for Windows, and it talks directly to what Derek has spent the last 45 minutes really just kind of driving home. And yes, a lot of it is stuff that we know. Like, we can know things. It's just a matter of, well, how are we supposed to do that? Well, just going to a least user access model or least privilege model, you can't just pull the switch, right? You need to do a little bit of due diligence ahead of time. And then even when you've done that, you've done a little bit of research and you said, okay, well, here's the applications that we think need admin rights, or here's the things we think are going to break if we do pull this switch. Well, we're not going to get them all, and then how do we actually account for that? We got to give rights back to the users. We're not going to go in and mess with the file system and allow full control for the users group on this file and that file, and then give specific privileges to those users. What we want to do instead is allow the applications or the installers or those system configuration changes, those things that particular user should be allowed to do, without anyone being over their shoulder or just, go ahead, this is your job, go ahead and do that, but then prevent, or at least in some way, put a second pair of eyes on the other types of things that can be done. And that's really what this PowerBroker Windows software does. Let me go to the right screen, good. So how do you deal with removing users' rights without obstructing productivity or overburdening the help desk? And again, we go back to what Derek was talking about as well, and what I was just talking about here. Well, we put a software in place that does that. So real quick introduction of what Beyond Trust is, or who Beyond Trust is. We were founded in '85. We are private and profitable, about 4,000 customers worldwide, and we have a set of tools that deal in the PAM, or the privileged account management, and the vulnerability management space. If you've ever heard of PowerBroker or you've ever heard of Retina, well, that's our product lines, right? So again, this is PowerBroker for Windows. The vulnerability side is the Retina, and then it's Retina something, depending on how deep you need to get into that. There's also a bit of a combination, even with this PowerBroker for Windows software, in if I want to elevate an application or just check to see if an application is safe, well, I take and I feed in some data from our other products to check before I allow that application to launch. Is it prone to vulnerability? Is it a high risk to the company to let the application run even as a standard user? Because remember, while the standard user really is the single best thing you can do for security, there are some things that can still get through and sneak in there even with just those standard user rights. So let's just do a quick check to make sure that the app isn't out there and something isn't out there trying to exploit it. Does the app have malware? We can even check on that. And if it does, we'll take some actions on it. So what does this thing do? Well, its core functionality is to elevate privileges to applications. Again, make the application behave as if the application, is in the administrative security group, not the user. I will not touch the user's rights. I'm not going to make the user a temporary admin. I'm not going to give the user a secondary admin account. So in my case, with using this, I actually do want UAC on. So in Derek's talks, he was going through some of the things you can do, and the third one there was to make them a standard user and don't even give them the option to see UAC. Well, if they're a standard user and they see UAC and they do not have any additional rights, well, they're not going to get past that. They used to be, but they're not going to get past that UAC prompt again. And then if it's an application that you've said to PowerBroker for Windows, nope, this one's okay, go ahead and allow this application to launch. And by the way, these are the very specific rights that are needed for that app, because we track that too. They won't see the UAC prompt. So what you get is the best of both worlds. They only see UAC when they do something outside of their routine, the things that they weren't supposed to do, or to be more benign, the things we didn't realize ahead of time that they should have been able to do anyway. And then, of course, we'll just enforce this least privilege model. We need to be able to track and control, like I said earlier, what applications are even already there, or in the future try to get on there, that have some kind of known vulnerability. We have the database. We know, because we have a tool that does a full scan. And like I said, we'll take a piece of that tool and give it to your PowerBroker Windows license. So as applications are being launched, we do a really, really quick check. Is it in the database? And if it is, this is the severity. Based on your tolerance for that type of risk, the app will launch, it will be denied, or it will be launched with even elevation if it still needs to. Everything that's being done on these PowerBroker Windows managed machines is reported back into a centralized sort of reporting platform. We call it Beyond Insight. It's officially the Beyond Insight IT risk management platform. I'll call it Beyond Insight for short. And it's going to tell me, hey, here are the applications that people are launching that are requesting elevation. So even if I do have admin rights, and when you start off, that's how you would start off. You'd leave me keep those admin rights. Or if you've already dropped them, go ahead and keep that too. But it's going to report back and say, here's the apps that are most likely to break. And then before you do anything or take the next steps, you'll have already created a set of rules that says, you know, Bloomberg is allowed to launch, or rather, Bloomberg is allowed to check home if it has an update. And if it does have an update, it can actually do that update. I'm still a standard user, but the app has the rights it needs. That's all I need. And then, because I've actually applied that rule, well, I can see that too if I want to monitor for those types of things as well. I also need to understand, again, what applications we're reporting back that have some kind of vulnerability risk. What applications do have some sort of suspected malware. It's not going to get in the way of what you use now as far as AV. It's just a sort of a secondary or a complement to the scanning that you're doing, because it's actually using data that's coming back to it. It doesn't need to take over and do a whole nother scan for you. And then on some applications, let's say I do need to allow you to run an application even though I know it has some kind of vulnerability. Or I allow you to elevate programs and features because you need, for whatever reason, to go in and uninstall applications or run some kind of system configuration. I can actually capture keystrokes and sessions and screens, basically, and report back, what did you do during the, while that application was being elevated? So this is all part of just that PowerBroker Windows license. And hopefully, if time allows, I'll show a real quick demo so you see the thing, sort of in motion. This slide here, I'll just breeze through it real quick. Basically, it's just showing why PowerBroker for Windows. Okay, so we talked about the deep capability, being able to go out and discover the assets that are on the network, whether you know about them or not. By the way, the discovery, the scanning that we allow for doesn't limit you to just Windows machines running PowerBroker for Windows. In that case, I don't even care if PowerBroker Windows is on that system. I want you to be able to go out and even see what's there. And once you see what's there and bring all that data back, you can really start to organize it and really start to give people rights to see particular data about my Cisco routers, my Linux boxes, my Macs, or my Windows boxes that are being managed with PowerBroker for Windows. Those are what we call smart groups. It is patented technology. There's actually patents awarded for it, and more in the works for pending, I guess. Talked about the reporting, and again, it's part of a broader solution set, but we're really going to focus on this one. So let me go real quick. Let me extend this. I don't want time out of that. This is actually part of the reporting. This is the data warehouse. So again, the nice thing about having a centralized reporting hub that's Beyond Insight is I'm not only this piece right here doesn't only take into consideration PowerBroker for Windows, but this lab's a little small. I really just run PowerBroker for Windows and PowerBroker for Mac in it. But if I was doing my vulnerability and my patch management and my more of my privileged account management, my password management and stuff, I would actually be able to see a report that says, hey, this machine right here, we've generated alerts from 3 different pieces of software or externally from like Palo Alto or Checkpoint or FireEye. So this one machine is reporting alerts from different security software. There may be an issue. At least we should go take a peek at it. That's the beauty of having everything come into one hub here. It's not looking to take over your SIM, but it is a good middle product if you do have another SIM you need to send data to, or if it's your final destination and not in a bad way, you can actually use it for that as well. But it actually just takes this data and combines it into an alert because we know what constitutes an anomaly. So rather than sending a bunch of raw data up to another SIM, we'll just send the individual alerts and then you can go look back. But this is the piece we'd focus on more. So if you were just starting off with PowerBroker for Windows, you'd come here and you'd say, okay, well, what's going on? Well, I can see that I'm running some applications that may need additional help. Emmet is one of those things, right? So if I'm going to run Emmet, I can't run Emmet as a standard user, and in most cases, I shouldn't be able to. But some people somewhere may have to. That's not a problem. I would just create a rule that says, hey, you know what? if this person, because I would actually filter them down, if this person launches this particular application, and I could track it either by the publisher information, Agent EXE was signed by Microsoft. If I cared about the specific version of it, I could do that too. Or, by the path, and that's pretty self-explanatory. And, of course, the hash of that particular binary. Either way I want to do it, I can allow for that to track. Now, as a standard user, when I pop over to, this is a Windows 10 box here, and I pop into data sources, real simplistic application, right? It doesn't matter much what app I'm running. It's just an app. And I try to go over and make a system DSN. Hey, guess what? I can't do that. Now, Windows is very kind to me. It tells me quite clearly, you're not logged on as an administrator. You need to be if you want to do this particular task. All right, well, again, I don't want to, and Derek would agree, we don't want to give the user admin rights. If I do that, havoc can be wreaked, even if they don't mean to. And you pointed that out, too, in the beginning of it, Derek. It's not that everyone's being malicious, and in fact, most people are good, we hope, right? But it just takes one bad person to do whatever on the network if they have the rights to do it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell PowerBroker Windows, hey, you know what? When this application launches, go ahead and let it happen. Just give it the functionality it needs. The rule was already here. It was just disabled. I just turned it back on. And if I look at a rule or a typical rule for PowerBroker Windows, there's always a trigger. In this case, it's a publisher, right? I mentioned that there's an application. In this case, it's ODBC-AD32EXE. That is the original file name for this. And it's signed by Microsoft. It's a product name. If I cared about the version, I could pop that in as well. And then once it triggers, and there's a small client on the box that's listening for these kind of things. It's also what protects the elevated applications. But once the trigger happens, then what do you want me to do? In this case, I'm elevating the application. I'm not using, application control, typical blacklisting, whitelisting type stuff. I actually want this application to be elevated. So I'm going to add in the same rights that the built-in administrator security group has. Doesn't have to be that particular group. It's just the most common thing. Well, after that, now that the rule is actually turned on, because I'm using group policy today, I could have been using non-group policy. I could have been using web services to get policy down. But in my case, I'm using group policy, which would update on its own in the background. And as this is updating, just as a point of reference, if anyone on the phone is familiar with group policy preferences, well, we made those. Microsoft bought that from us in 2006. So this product here, this PowerBroker for Windows product, used to be part of the same suite. It used to be called Policymaker. And then, well, when Microsoft bought it, they had UAC coming out. They were going to shelve this thing. So we didn't want to sell it to them, so we kept it. We just had to shell out to a new company name and a new product name. So now that I've just run this application again, now I can do this. Just a few seconds ago when I ran that System DSN tab, I got the message that says you can't do it. Well, now I can. No problem. And again, if it was an installer or an updater, like I don't want to elevate Adobe Reader, but I do need to elevate Adobe ARM. I want Reader to be able to update. I want Java to be able to update, or iTunes even, if you allow that to happen. But I don't want to elevate the parent application. In those cases, I can do that as well. So that was really, really quick. I want to respect time. We've just gone over a minute. That is PowerBroker for Windows, folks, and that's how you get to a least privilege model without the headache of your typical sort of mode of doing that.
Thank you so much, Jason.
Sarah,
wow, a lot in just a couple of minutes, so I appreciate that. If you could go back to the slide deck, and while you're doing that, I'm going to go ahead and launch our last poll, just based on what you saw and what Jason demoed. Would you like a free trial of PowerBroker for Windows? If you select yes, you will receive an email and get license details and all that fun stuff so you can get it up and running in your environment. So I'm going to leave this up for just a couple of moments. We had a couple of questions come in. Jason, stay on the line. This came in.
Got it.
Can PowerBroker for Windows track applications, services, et cetera, that may be started or launched in a non-interactive, non-user-initiated fashion, like malicious software?
So it won't. It can track non-interactive software. It won't be able to touch it at this point. There is some things in the works, though, based on some of, again, we like to integrate other products. So we have an AV product, an anti-malware product called EPP. Part of what that does is it tracks applications while they're in memory. We're actually going to take that functionality and give it to PowerBroker for Windows. It will never be an AV tool, okay? I don't want to do that to you. But there are pieces of an AV-like tool that fit very well in the Power Broker for Windows. So next year, what you'll see is things like buffer overflow protection or activities we know to be malicious. We'll track them on an application, and even while it's running, regardless of who owns it, if you want us to, we'll be able to kill it, or at least report it.
Great. I'm going to go ahead and close this poll. If you haven't voted, please do so real quick. Closing in 2 seconds. Okay, thank you. And Jason, could you go to the last slide? It is just announcing tomorrow's webinar. And, you know, this is the last one of the year, you guys. So thank you to everybody who has been attending our webinars all year long. We try to provide you guys with really rich content from a variety of experts and speakers on a variety of topics. So join us for our last one tomorrow. Advanced infrastructure hacking, some neat, new, and ridiculous hacks. Should be really fun. The bit.ly link is listed here, so look for that. You can always find it on our website as well. So with that, a kind reminder that you will receive an email with a link to the recording and the presentation within 2 business days from now. It will come from communications@beyondtrust.com, so be on the lookout for that follow-up. With that, I'd like to thank Derek and Jason for presenting their insights with us today. Thank you both very much. It's always such a pleasure working with you guys.
Thank you.
And everybody have a wonderful rest of your day. Thanks again for joining us.